A devoted caregiver is hired to look after a businessman's mother, who is showing early signs of dementia. Inside the mansion, she discovers the elderly woman is silently abused by her daughter-in-law. Determined to protect her, she exposes the truth, and what she reveals shakes the entire family. Michael Thompson had always believed that success was measured in concrete achievements. At 48, he had built a solid empire in the construction industry, erecting buildings that scraped the London sky and transformed entire neighborhoods. Thompson Construction was synonymous with quality, punctuality, and innovation. His name appeared in specialized magazines, at industry events, and in the conversations of the city's most influential real estate agents. To an outsider, Michael had it all: a prosperous company, an imposing mansion in Kensington, imported cars in the garage, and a standard of living few could attain. But what no one saw were the sleepless nights, the difficult decisions he had to make alone, the weight of sustaining not just a business, but also the expectations of everyone around him. Michael learned early on that being a man meant providing, protecting, and solving problems without showing weakness. His father, a construction worker who passed away when Michael was just 20, always repeated the same phrase: "A real man doesn't cry, he lifts his head and moves on." And that's exactly what Michael did. He studied engineering while working during the day and attending classes at night, saved every penny to start his own company, and built his fortune brick by brick, contract by contract. His mother, Mrs. Helen, was his greatest supporter. Widowed at 45, she raised her son alone, sewing for others, doing laundry, and taking on odd jobs in family homes. She never complained, never gave up. When Michael finally managed to graduate and open his first construction company, still small and modest, Mrs. Helen cried with pride. She said her son was proof that God rewards those who work with honesty. Over time, Michael prospered, moved to better neighborhoods, bought the mansion where he now lived, and of course brought his mother with him. Mrs. Helen deserved the best, and he would do everything to ensure she lived with comfort and dignity. For years, everything worked perfectly. Mrs. Helen was a strong, active woman, full of stories to tell. She tended to the garden, prepared hearty lunches on weekends, and spoiled her 6-year-old grandson, Gabriel, with homemade cakes and games in the backyard. Michael was proud to be able to offer his mother a peaceful old age, far from the hardships she had faced in the past. But life, he knew well, doesn't always follow the plans we make. Everything began to change about a year ago. Michael noticed that his mother was forgetting small things: where she had left her glasses, if she had already taken her blood pressure medication, the names of people she had known for decades. At first, he attributed these lapses to her age. After all, Mrs. Helen was 73, and it was natural for her memory to fail from time to time. But the episodes became more frequent and worrying. She started repeating the same questions several times a day, getting lost inside her own home and waking up in the middle of the night, thinking she needed to go to work. One morning, Michael found his mother in the kitchen, trying to light the stove to make coffee, but unable to remember how to turn the gas knob. His heart sank. It was then that Michael decided to take her to the doctor. After a series of exams, MRIs, cognitive tests, and neurological evaluations, the diagnosis came as a silent blow: early-stage dementia, likely Alzheimer's. The neurologist explained that there was no cure, only treatments to slow the progression of the disease. Mrs. Helen would need constant supervision, controlled medication, cognitive stimulation, and, above all, patience and affection. Michael listened to everything in silence, holding his mother's hand, feeling a helplessness that money couldn't solve. In the following months, he tried to reorganize the household routine to accommodate Mrs. Helen's needs. He hired an extra maid, adjusted mealtimes, and installed safety locks on doors and windows to prevent his mother from leaving on her own and getting lost. But it soon became clear that this was not enough. Mrs. Helen needed someone who truly understood what she was going through, someone prepared to handle the particularities of dementia. That's when Michael's wife, Patricia, suggested hiring a professional carer. Patricia was an elegant woman, with delicate features and impeccable posture. She was 42, with blonde hair always perfectly brushed, flawlessly manicured nails, and a wardrobe that looked like it came from fashion magazines. She worked as an interior decorator, serving clients from London's high society, and liked to keep up appearances. She and Michael had been married for 10 years, in a grand ceremony that was talked about for weeks among their acquaintances. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. Patricia was charming, attentive, knew how to behave at social events, and took very good care of Gabriel, her son from a previous relationship. Michael felt lucky to have a wife who combined beauty, intelligence, and good taste. As the years went by, however, Michael began to notice small changes in Patricia's behavior. She had become more impatient, more demanding, more concerned with status and appearances than with genuine connections. She complained about the size of the house, said they needed to change cars, suggested expensive trips and extravagant parties. Michael met most of her requests, but he felt that something had been lost along the way. The connection that existed between them at the beginning of their marriage seemed to have dissolved amidst social commitments, endless home renovations, and discussions about investments. Still, he didn't question it much. After all, marriages go through phases, and he was always too busy to delve into emotional matters. When Mrs. Helen received her diagnosis, Patricia showed concern, but also made it clear that she didn't feel prepared to care for someone with dementia. She had her own commitments, her clients, her routine. She then suggested they hire a live-in carer to take over all responsibilities related to her mother-in-law. Michael agreed. It seemed like the most sensible solution. He trusted that, with the financial resources he had, he could ensure the best possible care for his mother. The search for the ideal carer took a few weeks. Michael interviewed several candidates, analyzed resumes, checked references, and spoke with families who had previously hired such professionals. He wanted someone experienced, dedicated, and trustworthy. That's when he met Rose. Rose Oliver was 36 years old and had a life story marked by challenges and resilience. She was a single mother to a 12-year-old girl, Amanda, whom she had raised alone since the child's father abandoned them years ago. Without family support and with few resources, Rose had to learn to fend for herself early on. She worked as a nursing assistant, then took courses to become a carer for the elderly, specializing in caring for people with Alzheimer's and other dementias. She was a simple woman, soft-spoken, with an attentive gaze and hands calloused from work. She had dark brown hair always tied in a practical bun, wore comfortable clothes, and carried a mixture of exhaustion and determination on her face. When Rose entered Michael's office for the interview, he was impressed by the serenity she exuded. She didn't try to impress him with fancy words or exaggerated promises. She simply told her story with honesty, explained her experience with dementia patients, and spoke about the importance of respecting the dignity and individuality of each person, even when their memory begins to fail. Michael listened intently, and at the end of the conversation, knew he had found the right person. Rose started working at the Thompson mansion on a rainy Monday in April. She arrived carrying a small suitcase with her clothes and a few personal items. Michael welcomed her, showed her the room that would be hers, a spacious room on the ground floor near Mrs. Helen's, and explained the household routine. Patricia greeted Rose politely but distantly, as if performing a formality. Gabriel, curious, watched the new member of the household with wide eyes. Mrs. Helen was sitting in the armchair in the living room, looking out at the garden without really seeing anything. When Rose approached and introduced herself with a genuine smile, the elderly woman stared at her with suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked in a trembling voice. Rose knelt beside the armchair, gently took Mrs. Helen's hand and said, "My name is Rose, and I've come to keep you company, to care for you, to talk with you." The old woman blinked a few times as if trying to process the information, and then nodded slightly. The first few days were a period of adjustment. Rose observed everything carefully: the times Mrs. Helen liked to wake up, the food she preferred, the moments when she was more agitated or calmer. She prepared the medications at the correct times, helped the elderly woman get dressed, bathe, and comb her hair. She took short walks in the garden, stimulated her memory with conversations about the past, and showed her old photo albums. Mrs. Helen, though confused most of the time, seemed to respond well to the care. There were moments of lucidity when she recognized Rose and thanked her for her company. Michael was relieved to see that his mother was being well cared for. He could finally concentrate on his business without the constant worry that something bad would happen at home. Patricia also seemed satisfied. She told Michael that hiring Rose had been an excellent decision, that the house was now more organized, and that she could focus on her own commitments without feeling guilty. But Rose, with her experience and heightened sensitivity, began to notice things that didn't add up. Small details that, in isolation, might seem insignificant, but together formed a worrying pattern. Mrs. Helen showed an inexplicable fear whenever Patricia approached. When her daughter-in-law entered her room, the elderly woman would shrink in her chair, lower her eyes, and fall silent. Rose tried to attribute this to the mental confusion caused by dementia, but something about that behavior didn't seem to be just a product of the disease. One afternoon, while Rose was helping Mrs. Helen change her clothes after a bath, the elderly woman gripped the carer's arm with surprising strength and whispered, "She doesn't like me." Rose stopped what she was doing and looked into the old woman's eyes. "Who, Mrs. Helen, who doesn't like you?" The elderly woman looked around, as if afraid of being overheard, and said softly, "My son's wife. She wants me to disappear." Rose felt a tightness in her chest. She tried to calm Mrs. Helen, saying that it wasn't true, that everyone there loved her. But the old woman shook her head, insisting, "She says I'm in the way. She says I'm a burden." Rose was unsettled by those words. Was it just the confusion of dementia speaking, or was there something more behind those fears? She decided to observe the interactions between Patricia and Mrs. Helen more closely, and that's when she began to see. When Michael was at home, Patricia behaved impeccably. She would ask how her mother-in-law was doing, offer help, smile, and make affectionate comments. But the moment Michael left for work or traveled on business, Patricia's behavior changed completely. She avoided Mrs. Helen's room, spoke to her mother-in-law curtly, and made acidic comments about her illness. Rose overheard Patricia telling the maid on more than one occasion that caring for the elderly with dementia was a waste of time and resources, that it just disrupted the dynamics of the house. On one of these mornings, Rose was helping Mrs. Helen with breakfast in the kitchen when Patricia walked in hurriedly, already dressed to go out. She looked at her mother-in-law with an expression that mixed impatience and disdain. "Still eating," she said in a sharp tone. "Rose, you need to be faster. We can't spend the whole day on this routine." Mrs. Helen lowered her eyes and stopped chewing. Rose felt the tension in the air but remained calm. She replied politely that she was following Mrs. Helen's pace, that it was important to respect her time. Patricia rolled her eyes and left the kitchen without another word. That episode put Rose on even higher alert. She began to realize that Patricia made a point of highlighting, whenever possible, how inconvenient Mrs. Helen's presence in the house was. She complained about the space her mother-in-law's room took up, suggested it would be better to place her in a specialized clinic, and said the illness was embarrassing when they had guests. Michael, who spent long hours away from home dealing with construction sites, meetings, and clients, did not witness these conversations. To him, everything seemed to be working well. Rose, for her part, felt a deep concern growing within her. She knew the signs of elder abuse well, especially the psychological kind. She knew that such abuse was often silent, invisible to those who didn't live with the victim daily. And the more she observed, the more certain she became that Mrs. Helen wasn't just confused because of dementia. She was afraid, a real, justified fear. One night, when Michael had traveled to Manchester for an important bidding process, Rose was helping Mrs. Helen prepare for bed. The elderly woman was more lucid than usual, recalling stories from when Michael was a child, smiling as she spoke of the son she loved so much. Then suddenly her face fell. Rose asked what had happened. Mrs. Helen hesitated, but then said, "She comes in here when you're out. She says I'm taking up too much space, that I cost too much money, that I'm a disgrace to the family. She says it would be better if I weren't here anymore." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. She held Mrs. Helen's hands and asked gently, "Are you afraid of her?" The elderly woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm afraid to be alone with her," she whispered. Rose hugged Mrs. Helen, promising she wouldn't leave her alone, that she would always be nearby. That night Rose barely slept. She knew she had to do something, but she also knew that an accusation without proof could easily be dismissed as a fabrication or an exaggeration, so she decided to start documenting everything. She noted down dates, times, words, changes in behavior. When possible, and with Mrs. Helen's consent during her lucid moments, she recorded short audio clips in which the elderly woman recounted her fears. Rose knew she was treading on delicate ground, but she couldn't simply ignore that woman's suffering. The days passed and the tension in the house grew. Patricia began to show irritation with Rose's constant presence by Mrs. Helen's side. She complained that the carer was being overprotective, that she was preventing her mother-in-law from having any independence. Rose, however, did not back down. Her priority was to ensure Mrs. Helen's well-being and safety, even if it meant displeasing her employer. Michael, whenever he returned home, found a seemingly harmonious environment. Patricia went to great lengths to be attentive when her husband was present, and Mrs. Helen, confused and afraid of causing trouble, never mentioned anything. Rose tried on a few occasions to start a conversation with Michael about the need for him to spend more time with his mother, to observe more closely how she was feeling. But Michael, always busy, thanked Rose for her care and said he trusted her completely to handle everything. It was on a Sunday afternoon, during a family lunch, that Rose realized the extent of Patricia's coldness. Gabriel, the grandson, was playing in the living room with Mrs. Helen, showing her drawings he had made at school. The grandmother smiled, praised him, and hugged the boy. Patricia, upon seeing this scene, called Gabriel back with a firm voice. "Come here, Gabriel, don't bother your grandma." The child protested, saying he wasn't bothering her, he was having fun. But Patricia insisted, in a tone that allowed no argument. Gabriel obeyed, looking downcast. Mrs. Helen was left alone in the living room, staring at the drawings her grandson had left on the table, a deep sadness in her eyes. Rose, who had observed everything from the kitchen, felt her heart ache. She realized that Patricia not only mistreated Mrs. Helen directly, but also manipulated situations to isolate her mother-in-law, to make her feel unwanted, a nuisance. And the worst part, she did it all subtly, calculatedly, so that an outsider wouldn't notice the cruelty behind each gesture. That night, while helping Mrs. Helen take her medication, Rose made a decision. She could no longer remain silent. She had to find a way to show Michael what was really happening inside that house. Mrs. Helen deserved to be protected, to live her final years with dignity and respect. And Rose would do everything in her power to ensure that, even if she had to face Patricia's wrath, even if she had to risk her job. As she watched Mrs. Helen fall asleep, holding her wrinkled hand with affection, Rose made a silent promise. That woman would no longer be an invisible victim. The truth would come out, whatever the cost. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the days that followed were filled with meticulous observation. Rose transformed into a kind of silent guardian, attentive to every word, every gesture, every shift in the atmosphere within that mansion, which, from the outside, seemed the perfect home of a successful family. She kept a small, discreet notebook where she wrote down everything. The times Patricia entered Mrs. Helen's room, the tone of voice used, the comments made, the elderly woman's reactions. They were simple records, but together they formed a disturbing mosaic of systematic psychological abuse. On a Tuesday morning, Michael left early for a meeting with investors. Patricia, who was still in her dressing gown having coffee in the kitchen, waited to hear the sound of the car driving away before heading up the stairs toward Mrs. Helen's room. Rose was helping the elderly woman get dressed when she heard the door open without a knock, without warning. Patricia entered with a stern face, looked at her mother-in-law, and said in a cold tone, "Not ready yet? It's already 8 o'clock. Are you going to spend the whole day lounging around?" Mrs. Helen shrank in her chair, mumbling an apology that could barely be heard. Rose intervened with a calm but firm voice. "We're going at her pace, Mrs. Thompson. She needs time to dress peacefully." Patricia turned to Rose with a sharp glare. You're paid to care for her, not to give opinions in my house. If I think she's taking too long, she's taking too long." Rose swallowed the harsh reply she wanted to give, maintained her composure, and said only, "Yes, ma'am." Patricia gave Mrs. Helen one more look of poorly disguised contempt and left the room, slamming the door. As soon as they were alone, Mrs. Helen began to tremble. Rose sat beside her, held her hands and whispered, "It's all right, I'm here, no one is going to hurt you." The elderly woman looked at Rose with eyes full of tears and said, "She hates me. I know she hates me." Rose felt her throat tighten, but kept her tone comforting. "You've done nothing wrong. You deserve respect and affection, and I'm going to take care of that, I promise." Over the weeks, Rose noticed that Patricia's behavior followed a predictable pattern. When Michael was home, she was the model daughter-in-law, asking how Mrs. Helen had spent her day, offering help with her medication, praising Rose's care. But in the moments Michael was away, Patricia transformed. She became cold, distant, cruel. She made comments about how expensive her mother-in-law was, how much space she took up in the house, how much more practical it would be if she were in a clinic far away. On more than one occasion, Rose heard Patricia telling friends on the phone that having a mother-in-law with dementia was a real nightmare, that it ruined the aesthetic of the house and complicated the family's social life. One morning, Rose was preparing Mrs. Helen's coffee in the kitchen when Patricia entered with a friend, an elegant woman with red hair and designer clothes. The two were chatting animatedly about a decoration project. As they passed the table where Mrs. Helen was sitting, slowly eating a piece of toast, Patricia's friend stopped and said with a polite smile, "Oh, how sweet, your mother-in-law is here. How is she?" Patricia looked at Mrs. Helen as one would look at an inconvenient object and replied with false concern, "Oh, she's around. The disease is progressing, unfortunately. She's becoming more and more dependent. It's quite complicated." The friend made a sympathetic comment, but Patricia quickly changed the subject, leading her guest to another part of the house. Mrs. Helen, who had heard everything, lowered her head and stopped eating. Rose sat beside her and said softly, "Don't pay any attention to that. Have a little more to eat. It will do you good." The episodes of humiliation were frequent, but always subtle enough not to leave obvious traces. Patricia never shouted, never physically harmed her. Her cruelty was silent, made of scornful glances, impatient sighs, and acidic comments delivered in a casual tone. And the worst part? She knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative. When Rose tried discreetly to mention to Michael that Mrs. Helen was feeling rejected, Patricia would preempt her. She would say that her mother-in-law was confused due to dementia, that she was making things up, that Rose was being overprotective and creating problems where none existed. In one such attempt, Rose approached Michael on a Saturday afternoon while he was in his office reviewing contracts. She said she needed to talk about Mrs. Helen, that the elderly woman was showing signs of anxiety and fear. Michael listened attentively, but before Rose could go into detail, Patricia appeared at the office door with a tray of coffee and biscuits. She interrupted the conversation naturally, asking if Michael needed anything, saying he worked too much and should rest. Michael thanked her, took a sip of coffee, and turned his attention to his wife. Patricia took the opportunity to comment as if it were nothing. "Darling, I think Rose is a bit anxious. She seems to think everything is a cause for concern. Maybe it's the stress of caring for someone with dementia." Michael looked at Rose with an understanding smile and said, "Rose, I know you're very dedicated to my mother, and I appreciate that, but you don't need to worry so much. My mother is in good hands. She's being well cared for. If there's anything really serious, I trust you'll let me know." Rose nodded, but left with a growing sense of frustration. Patricia had once again deflected the conversation and discredited any concern before it could be fully expressed. Rose then understood that she needed concrete proof. It wasn't enough to report isolated incidents. She needed to document irrefutably what was happening. That's how she began recording audio during Mrs. Helen's lucid moments, always with her consent. In one of these recordings, made on a quiet afternoon while they were having tea in the garden, Mrs. Helen said in a trembling voice, "She comes into my room and says I'm a burden. She says I cost too much money for medicine, that I take up too much space, that I embarrass the family when we have guests. I just want to be quiet in my corner, but she keeps reminding me that I'm in the way." Rose held the elderly woman's hand and asked, "Are you afraid of her?" Mrs. Helen nodded, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Yes, I am. I'm afraid of what she might do to me when you're not around." That recording broke Rose's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. She knew she was dealing with a form of violence that often goes unnoticed, emotional abuse against the elderly. There were no visible marks, no screams for the neighbors to hear, but there was a silent destruction of dignity, self-esteem, and a sense of belonging. Mrs. Helen was being systematically devalued, humiliated and isolated within her own home, and Rose could not allow that to continue. The weeks passed, and the tension in the mansion became increasingly palpable. Patricia began to show open irritation with Rose's presence. She complained that the carer was always around, that she gave them no privacy, that she interfered too much. In an argument in the kitchen, Patricia said sharply, "You were hired to care for my mother-in-law, not to police my home." Rose replied firmly, "I was hired to ensure Mrs. Helen's well-being, and that's what I'm doing." Patricia narrowed her eyes, but said nothing more at that moment. She knew that firing Rose without a plausible reason would raise suspicion. She had to wait for the right opportunity. Gabriel, the grandson, was one of Mrs. Helen's few joys. The boy loved spending time with his grandmother, listening to her stories, showing her his toys. But Patricia began to limit these interactions more and more. She would say Gabriel had homework, that he needed to rest, that he shouldn't tire himself out looking after his grandmother. Mrs. Helen felt the distance growing and, in her lucid moments, would ask Rose, "Do you think Gabriel still likes me?" Rose always replied that he did, that the boy loved her very much, but that his mother was very busy and organized his routine that way. On a Sunday afternoon, the family had guests over for tea. They were Patricia's friends, couples from the same social class, well-dressed, well-spoken. Mrs. Helen, who was having a relatively good day, was led by Rose to the living room to join the gathering. Michael was happy to see his mother there, talking, smiling, but Patricia did not show the same enthusiasm. As soon as she could, she suggested that perhaps it would be better for Mrs. Helen to rest in her room, that she looked tired. Michael looked at his mother and asked if she wanted to go upstairs. Mrs. Helen, sensing Patricia's discomfort, nodded shyly. Rose accompanied her back to her room, and on the way the elderly woman murmured, "She doesn't want me to be seen. I'm ashamed of being a bother." Rose felt a rising anger, but kept her calm. She knew she had to be strategic. Confronting Patricia openly could result in immediate dismissal, and then Mrs. Helen would be completely unprotected. She decided to wait for the right moment to act. She continued to document everything, dates, times, comments, changes in behavior. She took discreet photos of notes Patricia left for her with cold instructions about Mrs. Helen's care, as if the elderly woman were just another item on the list of household chores. It was on a Thursday night that things began to escalate more dangerously. Michael had traveled to Birmingham for a construction trade fair and wouldn't be back until the weekend. Patricia, knowing she was alone with her son, Rose, and Mrs. Helen, took the opportunity to intensify her hostile behavior. That night at dinner, Mrs. Helen accidentally spilled a glass of juice on the table. It was a simple accident, something that could happen to anyone. But Patricia reacted with disproportionate fury. She looked at her mother-in-law with blazing eyes and said loudly, "Can't you do anything right? Always making a mess, always in the way." Mrs. Helen began to cry, apologizing repeatedly. Rose intervened immediately, cleaning the table and trying to calm the elderly woman. Patricia stormed out of the kitchen, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Later, as Rose was helping Mrs. Helen prepare for bed, the elderly woman was visibly shaken. She was trembling, crying softly, repeating that she was a burden, that she was in everyone's way. Rose hugged her affectionately and said, "You are not a burden. You are a dignified woman who raised a wonderful son, who worked her whole life, who deserves respect. What happened today was not your fault. It was an accident. Anyone could have spilled a glass." Mrs. Helen clung to Rose like a frightened child and whispered, "Don't leave me alone. Promise you won't leave me alone with her." Rose promised, her heart aching. In the middle of the night, Rose was awakened by a noise in the hallway. She got up quickly and left her room. She saw Patricia coming out of Mrs. Helen's room, closing the door forcefully. Rose approached and asked what had happened. Patricia, her face red with anger, replied curtly, "She was making noise. I told her to be quiet." Rose entered Mrs. Helen's room and found the elderly woman sitting on the bed, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. She asked what had happened. Mrs. Helen said she had woken up disoriented, thinking she needed to use the bathroom, and had bumped into a chair, making a noise. Patricia had burst in furiously, yelled at her and said it was unbearable to have to put up with this. Rose hugged Mrs. Helen, helped her lie down again and stayed by her side until she fell asleep. But she didn't go back to her own room. She spent the rest of the night sitting in an armchair next to Mrs. Helen's bed, determined to protect her from any further attacks from Patricia. As she watched the elderly woman's peaceful breathing, Rose knew the situation was becoming unsustainable. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to find a way to make Michael see the truth. The next day, Rose tried to call Michael. He answered between meetings, in a hurry. Rose said she needed to talk to him about something urgent concerning Mrs. Helen. Michael, worried, asked if his mother's health was okay. Rose replied that physically, yes, but there were emotional issues that needed to be discussed in person. Michael promised they would talk calmly as soon as he returned from Birmingham, but before that conversation could happen, Patricia found out that Rose had called Michael. She confronted the carer in the kitchen in front of the maid and Gabriel. She said in an accusatory tone, "You're creating problems where there are none. You're trying to turn my husband against me." Rose kept her voice firm and replied, "I'm just doing my job, which is to look after Mrs. Helen's well-being. If there are problems, they exist whether I talk about them or not." Patricia took a step forward, invading Rose's personal space, and said softly but with venom, "You're just a maid. Don't forget that. And maids who don't know their place are easily replaced." Rose didn't back down. She looked Patricia in the eyes and said with a calmness that surprised even herself, "I'm a professional, and my responsibility is to Mrs. Helen, not to the appearances you want to maintain." Patricia was speechless for a moment, clearly not expecting that reaction. She turned and left the kitchen, but Rose knew she had crossed a line. From that moment on, Patricia would do everything to get rid of her. The days leading up to Michael's return were tense. Patricia avoided Rose but watched her every move. Rose, for her part, never left Mrs. Helen's side, making sure the elderly woman was never alone for a moment. Gabriel, even without fully understanding what was happening, sensed the heavy atmosphere in the house. He asked his mother why everyone seemed angry. Patricia replied that it was nothing, that he didn't need to worry. Mrs. Helen, in her lucid moments, would ask Rose if her son was back yet. Rose would say that he would be back very soon. The elderly woman would then hold Rose's hand and say, "You are good. You protect me. I'm afraid of what will happen when you leave." Rose would squeeze that wrinkled hand and reply, "I'm not leaving. I'll stay here until everything is resolved." On Friday afternoon, Michael finally returned from Birmingham. He arrived tired but excited about the contacts he had made at the trade fair. Patricia greeted him with kisses and smiles, asked how his trip had been, and said she had prepared his favorite dish for dinner. Michael hugged his wife, greeted Gabriel, and went upstairs to see his mother. Mrs. Helen was sleeping, and Rose explained that she had had some difficult days, more confused than usual. Michael looked at his mother with love and sadness, asking if she was taking her medication correctly. Rose assured him she was. Later, during dinner, Rose waited for the right moment to ask for a private conversation with Michael, but again Patricia preempted her. She said Rose had been very stressed during the week, that perhaps she was exaggerating her concerns. Michael looked at Rose with an understanding smile and said, "Rose, I know you take great care of my mother, but you need to rest too. How about taking the weekend off?" Patricia immediately agreed, saying it was a great idea, that Rose deserved a break. Rose, however, politely declined. She said she preferred to stay, that Mrs. Helen needed constant attention. Patricia insisted, but Rose stood firm. That night, as Rose was helping Mrs. Helen take her medication, the elderly woman asked, "Does he know yet? Have you told my son?" Rose answered honestly, "I haven't been able to talk to him properly yet, but I will, I promise." Mrs. Helen held Rose's hand tightly and said, "I'm afraid she'll send me away. I'm afraid I'll have to leave my son's house." Rose felt a lump in her throat. "No one is going to send you away. This is your home. You have every right to be here, and I will fight for you to be treated with the respect you deserve." As Mrs. Helen fell asleep, Rose looked out the bedroom window at the city lights in the distance. She knew the battle was just beginning. Patricia would not give up easily, and Michael, too busy and blinded by what he saw when he was home, needed to be confronted with the truth in a way he couldn't ignore. Rose touched the pocket of her apron, where she kept her phone with the recordings, the photos, the notes. She had everything there. Now she just needed the right opportunity to show him, and that opportunity she knew would come soon. Saturday dawned with a grey sky over London, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Inside the Thompson mansion, the atmosphere was no different. There was a tension in the air that everyone seemed to feel, even without fully understanding its source. Gabriel was excited because he had a school performance in the afternoon, an event that would bring together parents, grandparents, and family to watch a play about English folklore. The boy had been rehearsing his lines since the previous week, memorizing every word, every movement. He was proud of his role as a mischievous imp. Michael decided the whole family should go. It would be a rare opportunity to go out together, to show that despite the difficulties with Mrs. Helen's health, they were still a united family. Patricia agreed, though without much enthusiasm. She said she needed to dress appropriately. After all, other mothers from the school would be there, and she had to keep up appearances. Rose suggested that Mrs. Helen should go too. The elderly woman adored her grandson, and perhaps the outing would do her good. Michael immediately approved of the idea. Patricia, however, made a displeased face but said nothing in front of her husband. When it was time to get ready, Rose helped Mrs. Helen choose a nice outfit, a light blue dress the elderly woman was very fond of. She carefully combed her white hair, applied a soft lipstick, and put on a pearl necklace that had been a gift from Michael years ago. Mrs. Helen looked at herself in the mirror and smiled shyly. "Do I look pretty?" she asked in an uncertain voice. Rose held her shoulders affectionately and said, "You look absolutely beautiful. Gabriel will be so happy to see his grandma in the audience." The elderly woman seemed to gain a bit of confidence, but then her face fell. "And will she be angry if I go?" Rose knew who Mrs. Helen was referring to. "It doesn't matter. Your son is the one who decides, and he wants you to go." The drive to the school was quiet. Michael drove. Patricia sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone, and Mrs. Helen and Rose were in the back with Gabriel between them. The boy chattered non-stop, talking about the play, his friends, his costume. Mrs. Helen listened attentively, smiling, asking questions. It was one of her good days when lucidity prevailed, and she could follow conversations without getting lost. Rose watched the scene with tenderness, but also with constant vigilance over Patricia's reactions, who occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror with a hard-to-read expression. The performance was charming. Gabriel did very well, drawing laughter and applause from the audience. Mrs. Helen clapped enthusiastically, her eyes shining with pride. Michael recorded everything on his phone, moved. Patricia smiled, waved, greeted other mothers, maintaining her flawless image as a dedicated wife and mother. After the play, there was a simple reception in the schoolyard with snacks, juice, and coffee. Gabriel ran to his family, still dressed as an imp, and hugged his grandmother first. "Did you see, Grandma? I did it." Mrs. Helen hugged her grandson tightly and said, "You were wonderful, my love. I'm so proud of you." It was then that one of the school teachers approached, greeting Michael and Patricia. She praised Gabriel, saying he was a dedicated student. Then she turned to Mrs. Helen with a gentle smile and asked, "And you must be the grandmother?" Mrs. Helen, a little confused by the noise and movement, took a few seconds to respond. The teacher, not noticing, persisted, What is your name? Mrs. Helen opened her mouth, but she couldn't remember. Her own name, something so basic, had been lost in that moment in the fog of dementia. She looked around, seeking help, feeling panic rise. Rose was by her side and quickly whispered, "Mrs. Helen." The elderly woman repeated, relieved, "Helen. My name is Helen." The teacher smiled, said it was a pleasure to meet her, and moved on to greet other parents. The moment passed quickly, almost unnoticed by most people present. But Patricia had seen everything, and her expression was one of pure, contained fury. Michael, who was talking to another father about business, didn't notice. Gabriel had already run off to play with his classmates, but Patricia had registered that moment of Mrs. Helen's hesitation as a personal humiliation, as if her mother-in-law had deliberately embarrassed the family. On the way back home, the mood inside the car changed. Patricia was visibly tense, responding to Michael's attempts at conversation with monosyllables. He asked if everything was okay. She said yes, but in a tone that indicated the opposite. Mrs. Helen, tired and confused by the outing, was quiet in the back seat. Rose kept her hand on hers, trying to offer comfort. Gabriel, happy and oblivious to the tension, continued to talk about the performance. As soon as they arrived at the mansion, Patricia entered the house with quick, determined steps. Michael followed her, worried, asking what had happened. She turned to him in the entrance hall and said in a controlled but emotion-laden voice, "Didn't you see? Your mother couldn't even remember her own name." It was embarrassing. All those parents looking at us, realizing something is wrong. Michael tried to calm her, saying it was the disease, that there was nothing they could do. Patricia crossed her arms and said, "Maybe it's time we consider other alternatives. She can't go on like this, appearing in public, exposing us like that." Michael turned pale. "What are you talking about, Patricia?" She replied, "I'm talking about considering a specialized clinic, a place where she can receive professional care 24 hours a day. It's becoming unsustainable here at home." Michael shook his head firmly. "I'm not putting my mother in a home. She stays here with us where I can look after her." Patricia sighed dramatically. "You don't look after her, Michael. You work all day. I'm the one who deals with all of this, and it's exhausting me." Michael held his wife's shoulders and said, "You're not alone. Rose is here for that." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Oh yes, Rose, the employee who thinks she's more in charge than I am in my own house." Michael was about to respond when Gabriel came running down the stairs, wanting to show his father something. The argument was interrupted. Patricia went up to her room without another word. Michael stood there in the middle of the hall with a growing sense of helplessness in his chest. He knew the situation was getting complicated, but he had no idea how serious it really was. Meanwhile, Rose was in the room with Mrs. Helen, helping her change and rest. The elderly woman was visibly shaken. She asked if she had done something wrong, if she had embarrassed the family. Rose assured her that she hadn't, that she had behaved perfectly, that Gabriel was happy to have her there. But Mrs. Helen shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I saw the way she looked at me. She was angry." Rose didn't know what to say. She just hugged the elderly woman and said, "You did nothing wrong. The disease is not your fault." Night fell on the house like a heavy blanket. Michael had a quick dinner and locked himself in his office to deal with some work. Gabriel went to bed early, tired from the day's excitement. Patricia stayed in the living room drinking wine, her face grim. Rose gave Mrs. Helen her dinner in her room to avoid any confrontation. The elderly woman ate little, still disturbed by the day's events. Rose stayed with her until she fell asleep, then went down to the kitchen to have something to eat herself. That's when she heard raised voices coming from upstairs. Michael and Patricia were arguing in their room. Rose couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was clear. Tension, disagreement, frustration. The argument lasted a few minutes and then stopped abruptly. Rose went back to her own room, uneasy. She knew something was about to happen. She could feel it in the air. It was almost midnight when Rose heard footsteps in the corridor. She got up and opened her door discreetly. She saw Patricia walking towards Mrs. Helen's room. Rose's heart raced. She followed Patricia, silently keeping her distance. Patricia entered Mrs. Helen's room without knocking, turning on the light abruptly. The elderly woman woke up startled, disoriented. Patricia closed the door behind her, not realizing that Rose was just outside, listening. Patricia's voice was low but laced with venom. "Are you happy? Did you get what you wanted? You embarrassed me in front of everyone today." Mrs. Helen tried to respond, but Patricia didn't let her. She continued, "I'm tired of this. Tired of having to pretend that everything is fine, that you're not a huge burden in this house. You take up space, you cost money, you disrupt my life, and today you made me look like a fool." Mrs. Helen began to cry softly, apologizing. Patricia laughed without humor. "Apologies don't solve anything. You should be in a clinic, far away from here. But Michael is too stubborn to accept that. So you know what's going to happen? You're going to stay quiet in your corner, out of sight, out of the way. And if I find out you've been talking nonsense to that carer about me, you'll be sorry." Rose could no longer stand by. She threw the door open, entering the room. Patricia turned, surprised and furious. "What are you doing here?" Rose walked until she stood between Patricia and Mrs. Helen, who was trembling on the bed. "I'm doing my job, protecting Mrs. Helen." Patricia let out a sarcastic laugh. "Protecting? From what? From me? You're delusional." Rose kept her voice firm. "I'm protecting her from anything that might harm her, including cruel words and disrespectful treatment." Patricia turned red with rage. "You have no authority to tell me how to treat my mother-in-law. You are just an employee." Rose didn't back down. "I am a professional hired to care for Mrs. Helen's physical and emotional well-being, and I will not allow anyone to mistreat her, no matter who they are." Patricia took a threatening step towards Rose. "You're fired. Go pack your bags and get out of my house now." Rose crossed her arms. "No." Patricia blinked, incredulous. "What do you mean, no? I just told you to leave." Rose looked Patricia in the eyes without fear. "Mr. Thompson hired me. Only he can fire me. And I'm not leaving this house until he knows everything that's happening here." The ensuing silence was tense, charged with electricity. Patricia was visibly struggling to control her anger. Rose remained firm, shielding Mrs. Helen with her presence. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice dangerously low. "You're going to regret this," Rose replied. "The only thing I would regret is abandoning Mrs. Helen now." Patricia gave them both a final look of hatred and stormed out of the room, slamming the door hard. As soon as they were alone, Rose locked the door from the inside and sat on the bed next to Mrs. Helen, who was crying convulsively. Rose hugged her, letting the elderly woman release all the anguish, all the fear, all the humiliation she had been accumulating. She murmured words of comfort, promised she wouldn't leave her alone, that everything would be all right. Mrs. Helen clung to Rose as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart around her. Rose stayed awake all night, sitting in the armchair next to Mrs. Helen's bed. She knew she had crossed the Rubicon, that there was no turning back. Patricia would do everything to get rid of her now, but Rose had no regrets. She had done the right thing. Mrs. Helen needed protection, and she was there to provide it, whatever the cost. On Sunday morning, the house awoke to a dense atmosphere. Michael came down for breakfast and found Patricia already dressed, made up, with a serious expression. She pulled him into the office and closed the door. "Michael, we need to talk about Rose." He frowned. "What about Rose?" Patricia began to weave a carefully constructed narrative. She said Rose was becoming problematic, that she questioned her decisions, that she was creating problems where none existed. She told him about the confrontation the previous night, omitting, of course, what she had said to Mrs. Helen. She presented Rose as someone who was interfering too much, overstepping boundaries. Michael listened, but something about the story didn't add up. Rose had always been respectful, professional. Why would she suddenly be causing trouble? Patricia sensed her husband's hesitation and intensified her attack. She said Rose was putting ideas into Mrs. Helen's head, that she was manipulating the situation, that she wanted to create conflict to make herself indispensable and thus secure her job. Michael shook his head, confused. "I'll talk to her." Patricia crossed her arms. "There's no point in talking. She needs to be fired." "It's her or me, Michael. I will not continue to live in this house with someone who disrespects me like this." Michael felt cornered. He looked at his wife, saw the determination in her eyes, and for the first time began to question if he really knew the woman he was married to. He said he needed to think that he wouldn't make a rash decision. Patricia didn't like the answer, but didn't press further at that moment. She knew she had planted the seed of doubt. Meanwhile, in Mrs. Helen's room, Rose was helping the elderly woman with her breakfast. Mrs. Helen was calmer but still shaken. She asked Rose, "Are you leaving? Are they going to fire you because of me?" Rose held her hand and said with conviction, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here until your son knows everything. I promised I would protect you, and I will keep that promise." Mrs. Helen squeezed Rose's hand, with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "You're an angel. God sent you to me." Rose smiled, but inside she was prepared for the battle she knew was coming. She touched the pocket of her apron, where she kept her phone with all the recordings, all the proof. Michael needed to see it. He needed to understand what was really happening, and she would make him see, even if it was the last thing she did in that house. Sunday passed in a tense truce. Michael worked in his office most of the day, avoiding both Patricia and Rose. Patricia spent the day on the phone, talking with friends, planning engagements. Gabriel played in his room, oblivious to the adult problems. Mrs. Helen and Rose stayed in the elderly woman's room, talking, looking at photo albums, reminiscing. It was as if they both knew these moments were precious, that soon everything would change. In the evening, Michael ate dinner alone in the living room, deep in thought. He looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall, taken years ago when everything seemed simpler. Had he lost control of his own home? Had he been so focused on building skyscrapers that he had forgotten to build a solid foundation within his own home? The doubts tormented him, but he didn't know how to resolve them. Rose, lying in her room that night, stared at the dark ceiling. She knew Michael was still blind to the truth. She knew Patricia was manipulative, convincing, and knew how to play the game of appearances. But Rose had something Patricia didn't have: the truth. And the truth, no matter how long it took, always found a way to come to light. It was only a matter of time, and Rose was willing to wait as long as it took, because Mrs. Helen deserved justice. She deserved dignity. She deserved to be seen, heard, and protected. And Rose would not rest until that happened. Monday dawned differently. There was a strange clarity in the air, as if the day itself knew that something important was about to happen. Michael woke up earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well. Thoughts about the situation at home had kept him awake for much of the night. He had an unsettling feeling in his chest, an intuition that something was very wrong and that he somehow had failed to notice. He had planned to travel to Cambridge that Monday for an important meeting with investors for a new project. But something inside him told him to stay. It told him not to ignore the signs anymore, so he decided to cancel the trip, sending an email to his team to let them know he would join the meeting by video conference. Patricia was surprised when he announced at breakfast that he would be staying home. She asked why with an expression that mixed surprise and concern. Michael simply replied that he needed to sort some things out, that he was feeling overwhelmed and needed a quieter day. Patricia didn't like it. She had plans for that day, plans that involved not having her husband at home. But she hid her feelings, saying she thought it was a great idea, that he really worked too much. She finished her coffee quickly and said she had to leave to meet a client. Michael nodded, watching her hurry out. Something about her behavior bothered him. After Patricia left, Michael went up to his mother's room. He knocked gently on the door and entered. Rose was helping Mrs. Helen get dressed. They both looked at him in surprise. "Good morning," Michael said. "How did you sleep, Mum?" Mrs. Helen glanced quickly at Rose, as if asking for permission to speak, and then answered softly, "I slept well, son." Michael noticed that exchange of looks. He also noticed that his mother seemed apprehensive, almost afraid. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. "Mum, I want you to tell me the truth. Are you okay here? Are you happy?" Mrs. Helen opened her mouth, but couldn't speak. Tears began to stream down her wrinkled face. Michael felt his heart tighten. "Mum, what is it? What's happening?" Mrs. Helen looked at Rose again, and it was then that Michael turned to the carer. "Rose, I need you to be completely honest with me. What is happening in this house?" Rose took a deep breath. She knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. "Mr. Thompson, there are things you need to know, things I've been documenting for the past few weeks." Michael frowned. "Documenting? What are you talking about?" Rose excused herself, went to her room and returned with her phone and notebook. She sat in a nearby chair and began to explain. She told him about Patricia's behavior when he wasn't home, about the humiliations, the cruel comments, the episodes of isolation, the veiled threats. Michael listened in silence, his face growing paler. Rose then showed him the detailed notes with dates and times. She showed him the photos of the cold notes Patricia left about Mrs. Helen's care. And finally, with Mrs. Helen's permission, she played some of the audio recordings. His mother's trembling voice filled the room. "She comes into my room and says I'm a burden. She says I cost too much money for medicine, that I take up too much space, that I embarrass the family when we have guests. I just want to be quiet in my corner, but she keeps reminding me that I'm in the way." Michael felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He continued to listen in disbelief. "She wants me to disappear. She says it would be better if I weren't here anymore. I'm afraid to be alone with her." When the audio finished, Michael had tears in his eyes. He looked at his mother, who was crying softly, and then at Rose. "Is this true? Is all of this true?" Rose nodded. "I wanted to talk to you sooner, sir, but there was always something preventing it. And I couldn't leave Mrs. Helen alone. I couldn't risk her being unprotected." Michael covered his face with his hands, trying to process it all. "How could I have been so blind? How did I not see it?" Rose spoke gently. "You were busy, sir. You trusted that things were under control, and Mrs. Thompson is very good at keeping up appearances. But the truth is, Mrs. Helen has been suffering from emotional abuse for months." Michael stood up, pacing the room. Anger was rising inside him, but so was guilt. He felt he had failed his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He approached Mrs. Helen, knelt by the bed and held her hands tightly. "Forgive me, Mum. Forgive me for not seeing, for not protecting you as I should have." Mrs. Helen caressed her son's face. "It's not your fault, my son. You always took care of me." Michael shook his head. "No, Mum. I outsourced your care. I thought money could solve everything, that hiring people would be enough. But I forgot that you needed me, my presence, my attention, and to allow someone to mistreat you in our own home." Mrs. Helen began to cry again, but this time they were tears of relief. Finally, someone was listening to her, believing her, validating her suffering. Rose remained discreet, giving them space for that moment between mother and son. But Michael turned to her and said, "Thank you. Thank you for truly caring for her, for not giving up even when it was difficult." "You did what I should have done," Rose replied sincerely. "I just did my job. But more than that, I did what was right. Mrs. Helen didn't deserve to go through this. No one does." Michael stayed with his mother for a while longer, talking, apologizing, assuring her that everything would change from that moment on. Then he went down to his office and sat there alone, thinking about everything he had discovered. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness, disappointment, and guilt. He needed to confront Patricia, but he had to do it the right way, without exploding, without losing control. Patricia returned in the middle of the afternoon, carrying shopping bags. She walked in humming, in a good mood. Michael heard the noise and came out of his office. She looked at him and smiled. "Hi, darling. I thought you were in a meeting." Michael replied in a neutral voice, "I cancelled it." "We need to talk." Patricia's expression changed slightly. "Talk about what?" Michael gestured towards the living room. "Let's go in there." They sat on opposite sofas with the coffee table between them. The atmosphere was tense. Michael began, "Patricia, I need you to tell me the truth about how you've been treating my mother." Patricia blinked, surprised. "What are you talking about? I treat your mother with the utmost respect." Michael shook his head. "That's not what the evidence shows. I spent the morning talking with my mother and with Rose. I've seen photos, heard recordings, read detailed notes. I know everything." Patricia's face turned pale. She tried to maintain her composure. "Recordings? What recordings? This is ridiculous. Rose is making things up. I already told you she's problematic." Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't try to manipulate the situation. I heard my own mother's voice saying she's afraid of you, that you humiliate her, that you say she's in the way, that she should disappear. How could you do that to a defenseless elderly woman with dementia?" Patricia was silent for a few seconds, realizing there was no way to deny it. She then changed her strategy. "Michael, you don't understand how difficult it is. She really is in the way. The disease is terrible. She doesn't recognize anyone. She gets confused. She embarrasses us in front of others. I was just trying to cope with an impossible situation." Michael felt the anger surge. So the solution was to mistreat her? To destroy her dignity? "She's my mother, Patricia. She raised me on her own, worked her fingers to the bone to give me a better life. And now that she needs me, needs us, you think you have the right to treat her like a nuisance?" Patricia raised her voice. "I didn't mistreat anyone. I just told a few home truths, and yes, she is a nuisance. Sorry to be blunt, but it's the truth. Our lives would be so much easier if she were in a clinic." Michael stood up, trembling with rage. "You have crossed every line. My mother is not going anywhere. She's staying here in her home, being treated with the respect she deserves." Patricia stood up too. "And what about me? Do I have to keep putting up with this?" Michael looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You won't have to put up with anything. I want you to leave this house until we resolve this permanently. I'm going to contact a lawyer." Patricia was shocked. "You're kicking me out of my own home?" Michael corrected her. "This was never your home. It's my family's home. And you've shown that you're not part of it in the way I thought." Patricia tried to argue, to appeal to their years of marriage, to Gabriel. Michael said Gabriel could stay with him if he wanted, that they would discuss custody and visitation calmly. But right now he needed her to leave. Patricia, realizing she had lost, tried one last attack. She blamed Mrs. Helen's dementia, said the old woman made things up, that the recordings proved nothing. But Michael was no longer listening. He asked her to pack her bags and be out by the end of the day. Patricia, furious and humiliated, went up to her room screaming that he would regret this, that she would make an example of him, that he didn't know who he was dealing with. Rose, who had overheard part of the argument from upstairs, came down discreetly. Michael was sitting on the sofa, his head in his hands. She approached and asked if he was okay. Michael looked at her and said, "Thank you, Rose. If it weren't for you, my mother would still be suffering, and I would still be blind." Rose sat beside him. "You weren't blind, Mr. Thompson. You trusted. And trust is not a mistake. The mistake was hers, not yours." Michael nodded, but the weight of guilt was still heavy. Patricia left the house that same afternoon, taking several suitcases and casting hateful glances at everyone. Gabriel, confused and scared, asked his stepfather what was happening. Michael knelt down to the boy's level and explained in simple words that he and Gabriel's mother were going through a difficult time, but that Gabriel would always be welcome in that house, that he was loved, and that nothing would change between them. The boy hugged Michael and said he didn't want to leave. Michael spoke with Patricia, and it was decided that Gabriel would stay there until things settled down. In the days that followed, the house began to reorganize itself. Michael reduced his workload, delegated more tasks to partners and managers, and started dedicating more time to his mother. He had lunch with her, talked with her, looked at photo albums, listened to her stories. Mrs. Helen, despite the slow progression of her dementia, showed a significant emotional improvement. She started smiling again, singing snippets of old songs she loved, playing with Gabriel. The fear that had lived in her eyes began to dissipate. She felt safe again. Rose continued to care for Mrs. Helen with the same dedication, but now with Michael's full support. He consulted new doctors, adjusted medications, and hired occupational therapists for cognitive stimulation. The house, once filled with tension and heavy silences, began to fill with life again. Gabriel started spending time with his grandmother again, drawing, playing, telling her about school. Mrs. Helen, in her lucid moments, would say to Michael, "I knew you would save me, my son. I always knew." Michael, however, knew the truth. It wasn't he who had saved his mother, it was Rose. That simple, soft-spoken woman with unshakable determination who refused to turn a blind eye to an elderly woman's suffering, who put another person's dignity above her own professional security, who documented, fought, and resisted. Michael called Rose for a conversation in his office, a few weeks after Patricia's departure. "Rose, I want you to know that you are no longer just an employee in this house. You are part of our family. You did for my mother what I should have done, and I will be eternally grateful for that." Rose smiled, moved. "I just did what was right, Mr. Thompson. Mrs. Helen deserved to be protected. Every elderly person does." Michael nodded. "I've learned a lot from you. I learned that money doesn't solve everything. That presence can't be outsourced, that real care involves being attentive, being present, being available. I thought that by giving my mother material comfort, I was fulfilling my role. But I forgot that what she needed most was to know that she was loved, valued, and respected." Rose touched his arm gently. "You are learning, sir. And most importantly, you are changing. Mrs. Helen sees that. And she is happy." Michael looked out the office window, seeing his mother in the garden with Gabriel, both of them laughing at something the boy had said. A simple scene, but one that filled his heart with a deep emotion. "I realize I spent so much time building buildings that I forgot to build the foundations of my own home," he said. Rose replied, "But there's still time. Foundations can be rebuilt, and you are doing that." In the following months, the household routine settled into a new normal. Michael divorced Patricia, a process that was painful but necessary. Gabriel came to live with him permanently, visiting his mother on weekends. The boy and Mrs. Helen formed an even stronger bond, and Michael saw how enriching that relationship was for both of them. The grandson learning from the wisdom and stories of his grandmother, even when she got confused and repeated the same things. The grandmother feeling useful, loved, an important part of that child's life. Rose continued to live in the house, but now her daughter Amanda also visited frequently, and Mrs. Helen loved the girls' company. The two families, so different in their origins and paths, had intertwined in a way no one could have predicted. Michael helped Amanda with her studies, paying for a technical course the girl wanted to take. Rose, in turn, became a constant presence not just as a carer, but as a counselor, a friend, someone Michael trusted completely. One afternoon, almost a year after the events that changed everything, Michael was sitting in the garden with his mother. Mrs. Helen had better and worse days. The dementia was progressing slowly, but she was at peace. She took her son's hand and said in a moment of clarity, "You've become the man I always knew you could be, not just a successful businessman, but a good, present, loving man." Michael felt tears well up. "I learned from you, Mum, and I also learned that I almost lost what truly matters." Mrs. Helen caressed her son's face. "But you didn't lose it. You're here." "I'm here, we're together." Michael hugged his mother, feeling the fragility of that body that was once so strong, that had worked so hard, that had carried him in her arms when he was a child. And he made a silent promise. He would never again let her feel alone, invisible, a burden. She would be honored, cared for, and loved until the last of her days. Rose watched the scene from a distance with a discreet smile. She knew she had made a difference. She had not only saved an elderly woman from mistreatment, but had also helped a family rediscover what they had lost: connection, presence, true love. And that to her was worth more than any salary. As the sun set over London, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Thompson mansion breathed a peace it hadn't known for a long time. Inside there were no more silent walls hiding suffering. There were conversations, laughter, stories being told and retold. There was dignity being preserved. There was love being lived, not just declared. Michael learned in the most painful way possible that success is not measured only in professional achievements or material possessions. He learned that being present is an act of love that cannot be delegated. He learned that dignity must always be defended, especially when the person no longer has the strength to defend themselves. And he learned that sometimes it's the simplest people, those the world considers less important, who teach us the most valuable lessons about what it truly means to be human. Mrs. Helen, even with her failing memory, even forgetting names and dates and faces, never forgot the feeling of security she had regained. She never forgot that she was loved. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Rose, the carer who became a guardian, who became a friend, who became family, continued her work with the same dedication as always. But now she knew she had made a real difference in someone's life. She had given a voice to the voiceless. She had protected the vulnerable. She had proven that one person, alone with courage and determination, can change the course of a story. And Gabriel, the boy who witnessed it all, grew up learning that family isn't perfect, that adults make mistakes, but that the important thing is to acknowledge those mistakes and strive to do better. He learned to value the elderly, to listen to their stories, to treat them with respect and affection. He learned that dignity has no age, and that true love is shown in small daily gestures, not in grand, empty declarations. That house, which was once a stage for silent suffering, transformed into a true home. A place where everyone knew they were important, valued, essential. A place where the fragility of old age was not seen as an inconvenience, but as a natural part of life deserving of care and respect. And as Mrs. Helen fell asleep, in her comfortable bed, with Rose knitting in the armchair beside her, while Michael read stories to Gabriel in the next room, as the night wrapped the city in its dark cloak, there was peace in that house. A peace that was won, defended, and preserved. A peace that came from the knowledge that inside no one was invisible. Everyone mattered. Everyone was loved. The story of Mrs. Helen, Michael, and Rose is a reminder that often the worst violence is the silent kind, the kind that leaves no visible marks. But it is also a reminder that there is always hope when there is at least one person willing to see, to listen, to act. A person who refuses to be a silent accomplice to cruelty. A person who understands that defending the dignity of others is, in the end, defending one's own humanity. And so, in that mansion in Kensington, 3 lives intertwined in a way that changed them all forever. The businessman learned that success without human connection is empty. The carer learned that her voice and her actions matter more than she imagined. And the elderly woman learned that even in fragility, even in the confusion of dementia, she was still worthy of love, respect, and protection. Because in the end, that's what we all seek, to know that we matter, that we are seen, that we are loved, no matter our age, no matter our condition. Human dignity is a right that is not lost, not negotiated, not outsourced. It is something we defend, always, unconditionally. It is the only thing that truly defines us as human. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Helen, Michael, and Rose has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of dignity, family love, and the courage to stand up for those who cannot defend themselves, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and remind us of what truly matters in life. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another narrative that will make you reflect on family, love, and the values that make us truly human. See you soon.